Today's lesson is on alternative theories. Alternative theories to neo-darwinism as a mechanism of evolution. Actually, when Origin of Species came out, you may recall from the historical part of our lesson that there were people that already had doubts about it at the very beginning. The biologists of the time, like Louise Agassiz and some of the others that were very knowledgeable in paleontology and biology and knew about the fossil record and everything else, they had serious doubts about Darwin's theory at the onset. These were not doubts based upon biblical concepts. Although some of these men may have been Christians, that wasn't their criticism of Darwin. Their criticism of Darwin was it didn't make sense from a biological standpoint. It didn't make sense from the evidence that was around them. So the critics of evolution have always been there. What's happened though is as evolution became more ensconced in our psyche, and it became part of science and everything that was taught in science, more and more men began to look at, okay, let's look at it from a scientific standpoint. From a logical standpoint, it might make a little bit of sense, the gradualism aspect of evolution. That may make a little bit of sense, but let's look at it from a scientific standpoint. And so not too long after his publication, you started seeing other theories abound. Now these theories were still naturalistic, and they're still evolutionary, if you want to use that word, but they're not neo-Darwin evolution. And so that's what we'll be looking at today, some of the current theories. Now, just on the surface, if you've got multiple theories about evolution that are not neo-Darwinism, what does that tell you about evolution? Logically.
Not very well established.
They don't know, right? It's not very well established. If you've got now, for so long, neo-Darwinism, that was the standard. And now you've got multiple theories out there, and we'll look at them. They've all, I use the term, they're all a variation on a theme. That's what they are. They're all a variation on a theme, but they're trying to get evolution to be more, make it more fit with what the evidence is. And the evidence is the fossil record and the concept of gradualism just doesn't fit. But there's so many of them out there like we just said, they just don't know. There's too many theories. They're kind of back to square one, if you will, and that to me poses a problem right there. Now, I'm not saying most scientists don't believe in neo-Darwinism at this time. There's still that's still the preponderant theory. That's still the preponderant theory that's out there. But there's more and more scientists, paleontologists, biologists, evolutionary biologists, which is a new term. 40 years ago that wasn't a concept, but now we have, quote, evolutionary developmental biologists, and they're all studying new ways that evolution could have occurred because they realize what we have just doesn't work. But when we look at these theories, let's refresh what neo-Darwinism says. For neo-Darwinism to occur, there's three fundamental processes that must occur. And we've looked at this many, many times in this class. You ought to have this down by heart by now, but I just want to review them very, very quickly. First, change must be the result of random, minute variations or mutations. So evolution is a random process. If you want to use the word, it's a chance process, then it's a chance process. Certainly the beginning of life had to be by chance, the random production of molecules that resulted in life. But for evolution to occur, you must have these random, minute variations or mutations. Why must they be minute? Because we know major mutations are harmful universally. They're just harmful and they don't work. So they have to be minute. The second thing is you have to have the process of natural selection. And it takes these changes and variations and mutations and selects out the traits that allow for the survival of the most fit. So the mutation has to be, what this second sentence is basically saying is the mutation has to be beneficial. If it's not beneficial, the organism will select it out. It won't work. And of course we know that the vast number of mutations that we see are not beneficial. But that's what has to happen. And what's the third thing that must be there? They got to be inheritable. If you can't inherit them, then you can't have a change. So these are the three fundamental principles of neo-Darwinism. And we, like I say, we've looked at it in this class. But like we said, many evolutionary biologists now have serious doubts about the orthodox neo-Darwinian theory. They just do. They don't. They see that there's a doubt. And the biggest doubt they have has to do with the concept of gradualism. That's where the biggest doubt comes in. Because I forget which class it was that we studied this, but the likelihood of mutations producing a new animal or species are just astronomically against them. You would call it a mathematical impossibility if you had any sense at all. If you were using your rational mind and deductive reasoning, you would realize that they would be mathematically impossible to do. So that's the problem with neo-Darwinism, and it's gradualism that's required. And so what is the common denominator in all these theories? The common denominator in all these theories is they have to find some way to speed the process up. Because if you can't speed the process up, they realize there's not enough time. So you're back to that kind of the idea of saltation. That's a word we used early in the class. Saltation is sudden leaps. A bird becoming, a reptile becoming a bird. That would be a sudden leap. Now, none of them believe that. They don't believe in saltation like they used the word earlier on. But they have to do something to speed the process up. Why? Because they're aware that the record just simply doesn't support it. The fossil record especially. That's why you have biologists saying, well, the fossil record isn't important anymore. We don't need the fossil record. You just don't need it. So if you don't like it, it don't fit, well, you throw it out, so they don't need it. Now, this is a comment from a Cambrian paleontologist. This is Simon Conway Morris. And this is his point of view. It's not our point of view, but it's his point of view. And he looks at the book, The Origin of the Species, and he says that everywhere else in the origins, the argument slides by skillfully into place. So it sort of makes sense. Sort of makes sense. The towering edifice rises and the creationists are left permanently in the shadow. But when it comes to the seemingly abrupt appearance of animal fossils, this doesn't work. And for Conway, this opened the way to post-Darwinian world, which is what we're looking at now, and those, the things we're going to look at now. So Darwin's theory may have made some sort of theoretical sense, but it just doesn't fit the evidence at all. So these new theories are still evolutionary, and they're still naturalistic. That's the whole point. They have to believe in naturalism. You cannot accept, if you're a scientist, some scientists, not every scientist, but if you're some scientist, and I guess if you're a scientist especially that spent all of his or her life looking at evolution and developmental evolution and so forth, you have to have a naturalistic concept. You can't have a supernatural concept. So all these have that in common. Let's look at a little historical background. Probably very early on, the first one to really challenge Darwin was Richard Goldschmidt. This was back in the 1930s and the 1940s. And for Goldschmidt, again, since the evidence wasn't there, there had to be a sudden onset of distinct species, which of course is what the fossil record indicates, that there's these fossil evidence of these species, and they're all fully developed when you see them. There's no gradualism, there's no transitional states, and we looked at this significantly in this class. So the only concept that he could come up for evolution to occur was something called the hopeful monster. Now, he didn't get this all by himself. There was a German biologist by the name of Otto Schinderwolf. And Schinderwolf said, you know, when you just say, well, where did we get the bird from? We studied in this class. Where did the bird supposedly come from? Reptile, right? Well, from Schinderwolf's point of view, the bird just hatched from a reptile egg. You had a lizard that was supposed to be born, and instead what was born was a bird. Now that's preposterous, and we know that's preposterous, but this is how flawed they understand neo-Darwinism or Darwinism was. And Goldschmidt was as you might imagine, Goldschmidt was highly ridiculed for this idea that for evolution to occur, there had to be some sort of quote-unquote hopeful monster. And nobody accepted this, and certainly nobody accepts it now that saltation occurs. But it wasn't too many years later, in the 1960s and 1970s, a group of men, and I've just listed two here, but there was quite a few, not just men but women, that come up with another concept. It was called punctuated equilibrium. You've heard this in this class already too. We've mentioned it a time or two. And it was first proposed by Niles Eldredge. And then it was later, the mantle was sort of picked up by Stephen Gould, who became sort of his spokesperson, or the spokesperson for punctuated equilibrium, which is also sometimes referred to as punk-eq. So when we refer to punk-eq, that's what we're talking about. What does punctuated equilibrium mean? Now, let me make something clear. We do not have time to go into detail on these theories. I mean, you could spend hours and hours looking at the detail of these theories, and that's not the purpose of this class. My purpose of the class is just to expose you to some of them and show the flaws in them and also show the kind of the commonality that they all have. But we're not going to go into great detail on what punctuated equilibrium is. For one reason, it's been kind of, nobody believes it anymore. You know, it was a good attempt, but even the developmental evolutionists don't believe this anymore. So we're not going to spend a great detail looking at it. But it's basically evolution within species, or from species, evolution from one species to another. And again, once again, the common denominator in this is something to speed the process up. And that's what punk-eq did. Species would be static for a period of time, and then there would be this rapid speciation where the species would change due to various factors. And then it would remain static again, and then you'd have a new species that occurred as a result of it, and then they would have rapid speciation again. And they use the concept of something called allopatric speciation. Again, I'm not going to go into detail what that is, but Gold and Eldridge found the absence of the changes in the fossil record very interesting. So do we, you know, find it very interesting, very curious. And what was their concept? It was this concept, well, how could you get around that? And it was through allopatric speciation. And it was looking at population genetics, and it was looking at things like that. Interestingly, this was when, if you recall, when I started this class, I was taking a class in population genetics. And that was where the professor had told me that molecules to man evolution is a fantasy. That's what his specialty was at the University of Houston at the time. It was population genetics. And the problem with population genetics, and this is kind of a diagram again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but different speciations on how these occurred. Initial step of speciation, then the evolution and reproduction, then reproduction and isolation, and then a new distinct species. But the problem with this is allopatric speciation proposed a selection based on species competing with one another, but in population genetics, typically populations of organisms, it's quite difficult for new genetic traits to spread through an entire population. Very difficult to get a new, even in the variation of the genetics within that species. This is not an easy thing to do. And as a result of that, the population genetics realized that punk-eq just doesn't work. Now there may be some people out there that still accept it, but it just doesn't work. Stephen Meyer says, few, if any, evolutionary biologists now regard punctuated equilibrium as a solution to the problem of origin, of biological form, and novelty. So it's kind of been, it's passé now. It's not accepted. So what is new? We get to the later part of the 20th century, not too many years ago for us. And you have this something called Evo-Devo, evolutionary development. And it was a development that occurred, once again, to try to explain how evolution could occur in a quicker manner and get away from the concept of neo-darwinism. Now, Evo-Devo, or evolutionary development, was started, as I said, in the 20th century by several people, Rudolf Reif, Sean Carroll, and Wallace Arthur, and it was a discipline, if you will. And it became actually, you can get PhDs now in evolutionary development. But it's not one concept. It's multiple different concepts. Evo-Devo is not just one thing. And it can be kind of confusing sometimes because you refer to something as Evo-Devo. Is that Evo-Devo? Is it not Evo-Devo? But that's because there's many different varieties of these. But it was a whole idea, once again, on how to speed the process up. And so there are multiple variations of Evo-Devo. And they all challenge a key aspect of neo-Darwinism. That is, instead of new forms arising as a result of slow, incremental accumulation of minor mutations, Evo-Devo argues that mutations affecting the genes involved in animal development can cause large-scale morphologic changes. So it's those genetic changes that occur at the developmental stage, the embryonic stage, that allow for evolution to occur. That's sort of a common denominator for Evo-Devo. There's different ways they go about it, and again, we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at each one, but we'll just discuss them briefly. And this is sort of a diagram that Cherry found on the internet of one of the concepts of Evo-Devo. And it's just all, again, it involves a common ancestors looking at the evolutionary development through an embryologic point of view. So there's at least 3 distinct approaches, and really probably more than that. First of all, mutations producing modifications in large increments. Duh. Yeah, that's what has to happen. So it has to be something that produces these in large increments. One aspect of Evo-Devo is even neo-Lamarckian or neo-Lamarckism. You remember who John Baptiste Lamarck was? You get extra credit if you remember that. Well, he was the guy that felt that you can inherit acquired traits. In other words, concept would be if you became a bodybuilder and you really worked out and you developed really good muscle tone and muscle mass, that you would inherit that to your child. So your child would be born with big muscle mass. I mean, that's what inherited characteristics would be. To get more bizarre, you could say, well, if you cut off a finger, your child would be born with maybe missing a finger. Does anybody believe that anymore? Well, of course not. But now you got neo-Lamarckism going on to try to explain evolution. We've kind of jumped off the boat, you know, when it comes to that. And then another one I really like this one, is natural genetic engineering. We'll talk about that in a minute, but those are kind of 3 broad categories of neo-Lamarckism. of Evo-Devo. So the problem with all Evo-Devo mechanisms, this is a big problem with all Evo-Devo mechanisms. This comes from Stephen Meyer as well. And that is, you have to throw away a lot of research that's been going on for the last 100 years to even come up with these ideas. You got to throw away 100 years of a mutagenic experiments where they've been experimenting with mutations, trying to show evolution could occur through mutations. And all the scientific work that's been done for 100 years, you basically have to throw this away for Evo-Devo to be viable. So early acting developmental mutations have never been able to cause stable, large-scale changes in animal body plans. So just throw that stuff away. You got to come up with something if you realize neo-Darwinism doesn't work. Major changes produced by mutations are not viable, and viable changes not major. Have we heard this concept before? If you've been in this class and you've kept your ears open, you've heard this concept before. Yes, we've heard it before. That's the problem with mutations. Mutations that are viable are minor, and viable changes are not. Major changes are not viable. You can say it different ways, but that's the problem with mutations. A mutation that does anything at all is so minor it's not going to change the species. We're not saying mutations don't occur. We know mutations occur. That's not the question. The question is, can mutations produce a new species? That's the whole thing. We see mutations in our medical practice. Some of them are so common that we even have names for them. They're syndromes. We know they occur. You know what? I've never found one yet that was to the benefit of that individual. Have you, Toby? I don't know of any of those mutations that we occur where we have to treat those patients for a problem that was beneficial to that individual. It's always detrimental. So we've looked at this, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. A lot of them look at the Hox genes. Remember the Hox genes? The Hox genes are those genes that determine development. You know, they're genes that are specific, that occur in the development of the organism. And the Evo-Devo people look at the Hox genes and they really jump on the Hox genes because they say, aha, if we can get a change in the Hox genes, we can get a real significant change in the organism. So Hox genes are those genes that regulate the expression of protein coding genes in the process of animal development. And I'm not sure what that picture is supposed to show us, but it's kind of the concept of how Hox genes could produce a different species. Okay, of course, you've got there a lizard at the bottom, and then you got our roadrunner at the top. Once again, going from a reptile to the bird. The problem with Evo-Devo's biology is because the Hox genes coordinate the expression of so many other genes. Mutations in the Hox genes have proven universally harmful. They just do. You can't change the Hox genes, even in the laboratory, and produce something that's beneficial. There's other problems too. Hox genes are expressed at the beginning of animal development. That's when they're expressed, and that's it. Thirdly, Hox genes provide information for building proteins that function as switches and turn off and on other genes. They themselves do not contain information for the building of structures. They're basically switches. That's what the Hox genes are. A mutation in them would not change the structure. In fact, epigenetic information in structures actually determines the function of many of the Hox genes. Remember what epigenetic information is. That's information that's not in the chromosome. It's in the other part of the cell. Michael Lynch. So we're going to look at a few of these really quickly, and these are all part of Evo-Devo, just to let you know where we're going. Michael Lynch, geneticist at Indiana University, proposed a neutral or non-adaptive theory of evolution. So evolution was neutral or non-adaptive. That's interesting, isn't it? And Lynch believes in small populations neutral processes such as random mutation and genetic recombination and genetic drift could predominate their effects on natural selection. Problem with this theory is, unfortunately, it fails in that it offers no explanations for some of the crucial molecular machinery needed in the eukaryotic cell. That's the normal cells that we have in animals, to produce changes in form. He also overlooks crucial epigenetic information in the fact that genetic drift does not favor beneficial mutations and vastly underestimates the waiting times required to generate complex adaptations. We've seen that concept before too. Most of these theories completely miscalculate how long some of these changes would occur. Now, we talked about neo-Lamarckian theory. And neo-Lamarckian theory, one of its strongest proponents is Eva Jablonka of Tel Aviv University. And she believes that neo-Lamarckism allows evolutionary possibilities denied by the modern synthesis. In other words, she understands that modern neo-Darwinism can't work. So if you accept neo-Lamarckian epigenetic changes can be inherited and so forth, then you can speed this process up. And she states the reason is that these modern syntheses are variations are blind and are genetic nucleic acid based. Yes, that's what neo-Darwinism is. It's nucleic acid based. It changes in the DNA. So she's looking for something else. And because of that, saltation events cannot contribute to evolution. So she proposes neo-Lamarckian epigenetic inheritance. In other words, acquired characteristics in the epigenetic information can be passed on to the next generation. Therefore, you get away from the idea of changes in the DNA. The problem is neo-Lamarckian mechanisms cannot explain the origin of animal form once again. Neo-Lamarckian mechanisms involve structures that either do not change or do not persist over more than several generations. Then you got another, that's another type of Evo-Devo. Okay, this is now Evo-Devo again. This is all a developmental evolutionary development. And James Shapiro of the University of Chicago, he proposed a natural genetic engineering. He observed that within population, organisms often modify themselves in response to different environmental changes. So Shapiro favors an evolutionary view that emphasizes pre-programmed adaptive capacity or engineered changes. Organisms could respond in a cognitive way. Two phrases there. What would pre-program suppose?
A programmer.
A programmer, once again, thank you. Yeah, pre-program. Did they not see a problem here? If it's pre-programmed, somebody has to program and it has to have a programmer. And organisms cognitively can change themselves. Cognitively means mentally. I can decide to grow another appendage or something. It's kind of a silly thing when you think of it. But it's out there because they got to come up with something. So there's obvious flaws. And that occurs with the concept of information. That's an obvious flaw in Shapiro's theory. So the last one we're going to look at, and this one's a fairly popular one, so I'll spend a little bit more time with it, and it's very similar to natural genetic engineering. And it was first proposed in 1993 by a fellow by the name of Stuart Kaufman. Kaufman proposed first the gene regulatory networks in animal cells, genes that regulate other genes, that's Hox genes, influence cell differentiation. And they do this by generating predictable pathways of differentiation. So to put it another way, networks of regulatory genes in embryonic cells determine the pathway by which cells divide and differentiate. Kaufman suggested a self-ordering property inherent in a wide class of organisms. For our evolution to occur, long jump mutations must occur, according to Kaufman. once again, common denominator in all these theories. You have to have these long jumps and mutations. But he's saying it's sort of a self-ordered thing. It's kind of like, and we'll look at this in a second, but sort of things in nature that are self-organizing, like crystals. Crystals are self-organizing. So he says, well, if it can occur in crystals, it can occur in living tissue as well, living organisms as well. And so he suggested this, again, sort of natural engineering. I see a lot of similarity with this natural genetic engineering in this self-organization concept of Kaufman. These are not stupid people, by the way. These are brilliant people. These are smart people. These are people that have, multiple degrees. But again, they're searching desperately for a naturalistic way for evolution to occur, instead of looking at the obvious. Self-organization processes, however, cannot account for the origin of animal body plans. These theories presuppose the existence of a developmental genetic toolkit. Now, does that sound like a program again? Very much so. This developmental genetic toolkit. You got to have this toolkit. You have to be born with it. So, who made the toolkit? And that is a whole set of genes, including regulatory genes, that help to direct the development of animal parts. We're back to the same problem that all these theories have, and that is, where does the information come from? Where to direct these changes? Where does it come from? Where does the toolkit come from? Self-organization theories have cited crystals, vortices, convection currents, and other physical processes having the ability to generate order for free. You don't need information. It just occurs. Crystals form, they don't have information. It's just a natural process. And they cite, I don't know enough about vortices and convection currents. Some of you people in the audience may know a lot more about that than I do, but apparently some of these these physical processes have a certain degree of self-organization to them. I know a little bit about crystals. But there's a problem, and that is this type of order seen in these physical occurrences in nature have nothing to do with specific order of arrangement. Okay? DNA, RNA, and proteins, on the other hand, are characterized by not simply order or complexity, but of instead specified complexity. And if you recall a lesson several weeks, or if not several months back again, William Dembski, this is his idea. It has to be specified information. Can't be what is referred to as Shannon information. It has to be specified information. And these natural things don't have this. Crystals, geologic figures, pattern lines, triangle, vortices, and spirals may be self-organized, but they do not exhibit specified complexity characteristic of structures such as DNA and RNA found in life. They just don't. And even they understand that now. Stephen Myers, this is in his book, Darwin's Doubt, he was in a conference. He goes to these conferences, these evolutionary developmental conferences. He's a very bright man himself, extremely well-educated man. And he talks to these people off to the side and so forth. And even some of them say, self-organization is really a slogan. It's what it is. It's a story. There's no scientific validity to it. And even Kaufman understands that. Kaufman said, life bubbles forth from natural magic beyond the confines of entailing law, beyond mathematization. Now that's Kaufman saying that. The first quote above that was actually Stephen Meyer. So self-organization theories have failed to prove a vera causa. What's vera causa? I didn't know it either, but I mean, it's kind of primary cause. It's the basic primary cause, vera causa. That's a Latin word, obviously. And they don't show a primary cause. There just isn't. They're back to self-organization and genetic engineering and all that, and they don't show the actual cause of that. Even if that was true, where does that come from?
Doesn't engineering imply an engineer?
It sure does, yeah. It implies an engineer, just like a computer that has a program in it implies a programmer, that's right. So, for evolutionary biologists, guess what? Mystery still remains. We still don't know. So that's why you got so many theories. Bottom line is, when you got that many theories, they don't know. Isn't that pretty obvious? Intelligent design challenges the idea that natural selection and random mutations and other similar undirected materialistic processes can explain the most striking appearances designed in living organisms. creationism, intelligent design. Sometimes you use those interchangeably, but you understand the intelligent design community is not necessarily religious, certainly not necessarily Christian, but creationists I could put in the same thing. We challenge that. We challenge that natural selection and random mutations can explain the most striking appearances designed in living organisms. So there's only two possibilities. This is where we go at the very beginning of our class. The only two possibilities that I'm aware of is either life is the result of purely undirected material processes, or something or someone of intelligence played a role. And which one now? After all these lessons, how many lessons have we had now? 20 different lessons. Does anybody have any doubt about that? That there's an intelligent design behind all this? God. Of course. I mean, the evidence to me is there. It's overwhelming. And I said that when you got through with this lesson, you would understand that it takes a lot more faith to be an evolutionist than it does to be a Christian. I still hold that, and I think we've proved that. Peter Lipton, who's a contemporary philosopher of science. This is sort of like Occam's razor. You know what that is, concept is? Most obvious thing that's going to happen is probably the best explanation. That's kind of a variation of that. And he says the best explanation is the one that best explains the facts, or that best explains the most facts. What is the best explanation? There's a creator. It's the best explanation. It fits all the facts. There's no contradictions in it. It fits all the facts. The best explanation that there is an intelligent designer, God, behind the origins of life.